Hello and thank you for tuning in. I am Paul Ogolla in Nairobi and I welcome our viewers in Kenya and around the world to On Time News, a program that focuses on global and exclusive look at issues affecting public worldview in economics, politics, health, and arts and culture. But first, let's have a glimpse of the top stories around the world. At least 5 people, including a mother and her infant, have died in North Carolina as Tropical Storm Florence Stormy moved from Tar Heel State into South Carolina, officials said on Friday. Head of Public Services Joseph Kinyua has directed all cabinet secretaries to go on vacation from Friday up to January 7th, that is 2019. In a circular, Mr. Kinyua pointed out that this will allow the ministers to spend time with their loved ones. Auditor General Edward has warned that Kenya could lose the port of Mombasa to the Chinese government if Kenya Railways Corporations, that is KRC, defaults in the payment of 227 billion shillings owed to Exim Bank of China. Now to the globalization. Economic supremacy battle is being witnessed as Western and Eastern countries turn Africa to be economical battleground. Looking ahead, Kenya's mere team GDP growth should rebound to 6.1% in 2019, dependent on completion of ongoing infrastructure projects, resolution of slow credit growth, strengthening of the global economy, and tourism. Kenya has potential to be one of Africa's success stories from its growing youthful population, a dynamic private sector, highly skilled workforce, improved infrastructure, a new constitution, and her pivotal role in East Africa. However, there seems to be a gap in realizing the country's greatness due to huge sum of debts currently witnessed in the country. Kenya's current public debt stands at approximately 4.884 trillion Kenyan shillings, or equivalent to US dollars 49 billion, or 56.4% of the country's gross domestic product. This is up from 42.8% in 2008. In other words, the country owes more than half the value of its economic output, GDP. The International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, recommends that ratios of public debt to GDP should not be higher than 40%. For developing countries, this level of debt, however, is comparable to that of other developing economies. For example, in South Africa's ratio of public debt to GDP was 53.1% in 2017. In 2009, it was 27.8%. Nigeria's was 21.3% in 2017. 2008, 7.3%. Brazil, India, China have ratios over 40%. However, the economies of these countries are several times larger than Kenyans. The Western countries have lamented over China's increasing levels of debt in Africa, trying to discredit China's relationship with Africa. In the recent past, Western countries have warned Africa over exploitation by China after the realization that China was already overtaking Western countries in Africa. What does this mean to Africa and Kenya? To our question, is the relationship between the West and East getting worse because of the scramble for Africa? Join the conversation by tweeting us again at Paul Ogolla or Facebook us on Ogash Space, and we shall sample your views in the course of this program. I'm seeing Colin Sorono on Facebook says that it is just the beginning of the long-awaited battle. We have been trading with Western countries a long time, and their benefits have been massive. Shifting to the East was the worst ever decision made by the Kenyan authorities. And now let us have a feature story that was done by our correspondent, Joan Bataru.
According to the research done by On Time News, over the past few months, a war like not weapon-based but economically oriented has been witnessed across Africa, not leaving Kenya behind. The Western countries against the Eastern countries, specifically the US versus China. The big question is this economic struggle further economic crisis or rejuvenation? This comes after Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary Monica Juma held talks with U.S. counterparts in Washington, D.C. on August 22nd, ahead of President Uhuru Kenyatta's visit 5 days later. The president then also held talks with U.S. President Donald Trump and also met U.S. business leaders. Later on, President Kenyatta then welcomed British Prime Minister Theresa May 3 days later in Kenya before flying to China the next day for a major African-Chinese summit on economic partnership. On the flip side, as per the survey done by Ipsos Synovate on August 23, 2018, 26% of Kenyans see the Asian country as a threat to the development of Kenya, more than double the perception towards the US, which ranks it 12%. Approval for China comes because of its infrastructure projects in the country at 86% compared to only 38% for US, whose loan and grants to Kenya wins it at an approval of 49% compared to a paltry 11% for China.
So I'm not in support of the relationship between China and Kenya or Kenya and the US because I believe that the Chinese are racist and most of their goods are fake goods and I don't trust them. And also they are very mean. And when it comes to US, they have so much protocol and they are also very hard to deal with.
I won't take sides between the West and the East. What I'll do is that I think Africa, we've become of age and we just need to utilize our resources because we're very vast and we're very blessed with resources, so we just have to utilize our resources and have a self-sustaining economy, and the economy will grow definitely.
Now, the value of investments done by the West or Eastern countries in Kenya will be impacted by the economic, political, diplomatic and social conditions of our systems, for diversification does not guarantee a profit or protect from loss in a declining market. For On Time News, my name is Joanne Mbataru.
Thank you, Mbataru, for joining us from the ground. How is business on the ground so far?
Well, Paul, business is as usual as more and more investors are coming into the country, and with the recent cases of expatriates from all these different countries, from the US and China, more and more people are coming in to invest in the country. So we are seeing more Chinese people around Nairobi County, for example, as well as other parts of Kenya. We are also used to seeing the white people as well from US and Europe through the UN at Gigiri, so that hasn't changed as much, but we are having more and more investments with more buildings coming up.
Wow. I don't know what is the situation because I believe that it is now dire based on the economical supremacy battle that is happening on the ground. What are people saying on the ground? Do they like the China? Do they go with the West?
Ideas are mixed, as some people are for the West, while others still think that the Chinese, who have been providing constant help with the development of the roads as well as in their technology. Although ideas still remain different, some are for it, while others who are against it say that they pose a threat in terms of taking away from Kenyans the jobs that should be rightfully theirs.
Wow. What is your take from a journalist's point of view as you analyze the situation?
Well, in my perspective, I think it depends on how the government is handling the moving in of these different countries and different people from these countries, that is the US as well as China, into the country. Because if they plan it well, it is likely that more Kenyans will be able to embrace it. But still, there is the fear of getting jobs or being mistreated by these expatriates from these countries. Back to your Gashin studio.
Thank you for the explicit information, Mbataru. Stay tuned. Looking at the social media opening, I'm seeing Gladys Sheila. She's saying yes, because they all want to do business with Africa. Now we are being joined by Mr. Hesbon Owila, a communication strategist. Hesbon, welcome to our discussion tonight. Maybe just to kick off our discussion, what do you think is the fate of Kenya's relationship with the West and the East?
For me, it's not a question of either East or West. It's a question of what would serve the interests of the common mwananchi in Kenya. If we have things from China, if we have bilateral relations with China that will help Kenyans and the people of China, then so be it. We would actually encourage our leaders, to have these kinds of arrangements. But if we also have things that we can benefit from the Western world, things to do with governance, accountability, and stuff like that, in the way we invest in these mega projects, I think for me it will be a win-win situation.
Hold on there, Mr. Hesbon. Let me bring in Mr. Philip Katumo. Philip, how is Kenya's relationship with the West and the East?
For me, it's like choosing the lesser evil. And when you look at the Western projects, they are more of infrastructure. But when you go to the Eastern, the East countries, they are more of infrastructure and technology. And therefore, when you look at the world and where we are heading to, it will all be about technology. And therefore, the East is more better because they are introducing the technology bit of it. But both of them are just equating and choosing the lesser evil.
Coming back to you, Mr. Hesbon. Now, where do you categorize this? Is it a rejuvenation for Kenya or a crisis?
Well, I think you can say that it's all of those three.
Yeah.
That there is some element of decolonization, there is some element of rejuvenation, and of course there is some element of economic crisis. Colonization in the sense that, both the West and the East, the Far East, that is, want to control Africa. And you see, that is essentially bringing back the echoes of colonialism. But why is it that they want to control almost all aspects, the political, the cultural, and the economic? And I think that is why it stops, that the fact that they've come back and they want a cloud brings back echoes of colonization. But then to a large extent, you realize that it's basically an economic crisis, that Africa is the biggest economic frontier. It is that space where most markets are looking at in terms of raw materials and of course in terms of consumption. That both the East and the West want to tap the resources in Africa, and both also want to send their finished products to Africa for consumption to boost their industries back in their countries. But then you'd say that rejuvenation only applies in the Western world, because since the new kid on the block showed up, that is China, the West has paid critical attention to back to Africa. Britain, for instance, is now very keen on Africa after so many years. This year we saw their prime minister came to Kenya, and I think the last time a prime minister came to Kenya from Britain was during the days of Margaret Thatcher.
Let me now bring in our last opinion leader, Mr. Pascal Matogi, an economist, the same subject. Could you please help us break down this subject? What does this mean to Kenya, in your opinion?
In terms of looking at that situation, in the first instance, whether the West left or whether they're still here, I wouldn't say the West actually never left. Simply because when you look at the system that they left and the system that they propagated, these are systems that enabled them to actually extend their agenda locally here. When you look at almost all the multinationals will essentially be multinationals that are important in the developed economies, which is the West, one. And secondly, even though these multinationals are handled by individuals who are Kenyans, say for example, or Africans more generally, you realize that these individuals are actually getting instructions from the West, one, and two, they are actually extending the agenda from the West. So these individuals will go there, will get trained, then they come back and they continue extending the agenda for the West. So while the West, you can say, Europeans, Americans are no longer here, But in terms of the agenda being, extended, that has continued being, moving on since, you can say our independence. And that's really to look at it from that perspective. So for me, the West, even though the people left, their systems are the ones that we've been using, and those systems have been extending the agenda.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today and for the heated discussion that we have had. Let's now sample your comments on social media. Martin Kamau on Facebook says yes because they are fighting the same girl. And finally, Mercy says no, these countries have been having issues since, therefore Africa has no portion in this. Now, giving my opinion is that Kenya was safer with the West before shifting to the East during Kibaki's time regime. The Cold War between the East and the West means better livelihood, better deals, and resources to the whole of African countries by the West and the East. Now that the shift is coming to Africa, we expect a better continent in the near future economically. This marks the end of our show. Thank you very much for having joined us on our show, On Time News. I have been your host, Paul Ogolla. See you soon.